Hello, everyone. I'm Hyoun Park here at This Week in Enterprise Tech here, joined as always by Charles Araujo. Hi, Charles.
Hi there, how are you?
Doing good, doing good. As usual, it's been a busy week in tech. I feel like every company out there is trying to figure out what to do with AI, and we're going to go through a bunch of examples of that today. But before we get into the enterprise AI tech companies, let's start with probably the biggest AI announcement of last week, which was that Facebook, Meta, came out with a huge AI launch last week, which included their Llama 3 model, as well as putting assistance on everything from threads to Facebook to what have you. And it just, they really went all in on AI. It's not the first time Meta's gone all in on a new and emerging technology, but how does this time around feel to you?
You mean like maybe like the metaverse, which they don't even talk about hardly at all anymore? Yeah.
Hmm.
The look, I'm impressed on a couple levels, and I'm obviously going to look at this from an enterprise perspective. But let's start with sort of just the building blocks of it. First and foremost, I've played with it a little bit over the weekend. It looks solid. It looks relatively impressive. I think it holds its own from a raw model. We talked over the last few weeks about the fact that we're seeing this sort of almost commoditization of the foundational models, and this sort of perpetuates that. It's certainly not a joke. It's the real deal. I think what is truly impactful, again, not enterprise at all, but it was truly impactful to the world, is that they have the biggest platform, or one of the biggest platforms in the
Hmm.
world. I would argue even more so than like Google or being in with Microsoft, because so much of the world spends time every single day on one of these meta platforms, meta products. And so it's going to open up the world to people like my mother, and ironically, because she's 20 some odd years younger than me, my wife, who
Hmm.
doesn't play with any of this tech, but she uses Facebook. And so it's like, I was just telling you the other day, it's like, I'd be able to convince her to try any of these things, but it's like, here, it's on Facebook now. Just hit the little round glowing circle and knock yourself out. So I think it's going to have the process or the ability to normalize everything. More broadly, though, from an enterprise perspective, I actually think this may be the dark horse to watch, because of all of that, because they have access to, whether we like it or not, this access to all the data in all these platforms to train the model, where they don't have some of the issues that, say, OpenAI does about having to scrape the web, right, for the training.
Hmm.
um, they're going to have this really interesting sort of position in the market that may, in fact, be very interesting for the enterprise. They have made a few overtures over the years towards the enterprise. They had, what was it called, Facebook Workplace, I think. They've tried a few times,
Yes.
and they've mostly been half-assed as far as the effort. But this one, the Llama is already available in all the major cloud providers in their workplaces. And this idea of portability, which is, we talked a lot about open source sort of AI, and there's still a lot of issues about what that even means. But I think there's a lot of enterprise execs who could look at this and go, I don't love the idea of being locked in with a cloud provider, and this ability to have a model that I can sort of have some portability with. It may be a red herring. It may not be true. There's all these fun, factors around it, but there may be an enterprise play here that we aren't fully expecting. So I'm fairly bullish on it, at least as an opening salvo, and I think good for them.
Yeah. What I find interesting about this approach so far is that Meta obviously has control of their data, for better or for worse. We have all signed up into Meta's data
Paul.
permissions, and they're able to get language in a variety of different models, whether it be what they're doing from the WhatsApp side or what they're doing with Facebook entries. Those are different types of writing that they're able to access relatively easily. And they're going to be able to update that over time, because I don't foresee Facebook disappearing over the next year or two, um, or WhatsApp or Instagram for that matter. They all have established themselves as gigantic services. And Llama 3 has also created kind of these different levels of model. There's, I believe, a 8 billion parameter and then a 70 billion parameter model. And the 8 billion parameter is kind of similar to the Databricks model that we saw, that we talked about recently, where it's going to be relatively performance friendly in terms of not having to use a ton of resources. Obviously, it's 10 times smaller than the other models, so that's 1/10 the processing by definition. And then the 70 billion model is going to be useful for larger general use cases where you need to really understand what is happening with language at a very detailed level. But at the same time, that may not be the best model for all use cases. That is going to compete more against, say, the Grok model, which is 300 whatever 60 billion parameters or whatever, or the large open AI models that are in the tens of billions of parameters. So they are setting themselves up both for that performance model that is good for actual, say, day-to-day operations, as well as your specialist supermodel. And I think that honestly, that when we look at AI from the enterprise perspective, we're going to be looking a lot at these, call it 5 billion, 6 billion, 7 billion parameter models, just because from a practical perspective, if you're running something in production, there are cost concerns, there's FinOps concerns, there are, we can only get so many GPUs or TPUs or computing unit of choice for AI at the IT level. So we're going to have to figure out how to make this work from a practical perspective. And Meta is putting itself as a player to potentially be able to help out across the board with these things.
Yeah, well, and they're reportedly working on a 400 billion parameter model. What is not entirely clear to me is, and this has always been their gap, right, is what that execution play looks like. And while I look at this and say, hey, this is a great starting point, we have zero clarity on any of that, in terms of, are they even, what they even intend on doing with this, right? I mean, for good or for bad, Meta, Facebook/Meta has always had so much money that they were going to, it's sort of like respond first and figure it out later. And to a degree, I feel like it's more of the same. But this is, right now we're in a war of the foundation models, and they're at least in the race. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. So one of the other things I saw during last week was that Facebook has also put AI assistance on things like posting on Facebook, and sometimes the results are not what you would expect. For instance, there was a post about in a New York City school group about somebody asking about getting assistance for their child who is, I believe, both autistic and gifted, or something along those lines. And Meta AI literally came back with a response saying, I have a child who is autistic and gifted, and let me tell you about how my child is going through the school system. The AI responses may need to be tweaked a little bit. Obviously, it was creating a response that was similar to other similar requests that had happened in the group. And that is a challenge that generative AI has in general, that it wants to echo the corpus of the data that it is trained on.
And you talked about the fact that it had its own data, and that it was all this different type of data, and it is by definition this very conversational, friend oriented data. So you're going to see those sorts of things. I also think something that in the long run I think is going to be good for Meta and their models is that most of the use cases right now for all of these foundational models are people that are fairly tuned in. They're early adopters. They're people like you and me. They're knowledge workers. And now suddenly Meta's going to have their models exposed to people that have no flipping idea. I mean, I remember when the first PCs came out, I was a kid. We called him my uncle, but he was a family friend. And it's like, he couldn't conceptualize what this was. He wanted to ask it questions, which ironically now you could probably ask ChatGPT or whatever, but you want to ask it like questions about the future. And I think you're going to have this very similar experience with people with these models, because these are the folks that are not at all tuned into what they are and what prompt engineering is and how to interact with it. And I think you're going to get a whole lot of these sort of unexpected results. And I also think the industry is going to make much more hay with it than is warranted. It's the nature of the beast with this stuff. So we'll see how it plays out. But I think it's going to be some good fun for a while anyway.
Yes, but goofy stories aside, I'm absolutely sure that Meta is going to create LLMs that are competitive with the market at large from a pure technology perspective. The question for Meta is always, how are you going to commercialize this? And although they're better than Google at this, they do also have the challenge that if a product doesn't impact 100 million people, they're not quite sure what to do with it. which is a real problem because most products never get to that stage, but can still be valuable.
Well, the good news is that this one is unquestionably going to impact everybody. It's going to be, and we're going to talk about some of these other announcements. I think it is also a leading edge of something that we're going to see become more and more problematic, and that is this idea that everything is going to have AI baked into it. And the question then becomes for us as users, for if you're an enterprise, for your users, when do you use which? Does it matter? How do you play that out? If you've got copilots in every single tool you're using, if you've got this sitting in Facebook, and are they giving you different answers? Does it, how does that part, we've historically, we've gone through this with a few different technologies. Low code, no code tools are another one of those, right? It used to be an entire category, and now it's simply a way that almost all tools are being orchestrated and
Right.
the way you customize. And I think you see this with a bunch of different things. And AI is going to be like that. And it's going to be a problem for anyone trying to differentiate in the enterprise. And it's going to create a real conflict. So conversational AI before all of the Gen AI stuff, right? In the conversational AI space that existed in a pre-Gen AI world, this was already becoming an issue because someone would deploy a conversational AI bot that was customer facing, and then there'd be another conversational AI for internal facing, and maybe the one be specifically for the service desk. And even as employees or customers, you start to get confused. Which one am I supposed to use? How do I? And so I think we're going to see a lot of the same thing, and there's going to be some opportunities for some normalization. I mean, we've said this before. We're very, very early days, but I think on the surface, you can't roll out Facebook or have Facebook or Threads or Instagram and not have an agent, right? Snapchat has theirs. Every tool is going to have something. And then the question is it just a got to have it feature and it's just there? Or is it an actual in the market play? And that's going to be the big question for Meta with what they actually end up doing with this.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to compare that to some other companies that have also been working on Gen AI. So last week, one of the original chatty applications that has also been thinking about how to use text as an operating system or operating capability also came out with Gen AI capabilities. Slack, of course, now a Salesforce company, but last week, they came out with their own set of capabilities around generative AI. And I know this has been a vision for them for a long time. Even before the LLMs really started impacting the world, Slack and Salesforce saw Slack as a potential capability to be the interface between users and applications. But they were lacking the natural language savvy that existed in LLMs. So now it feels like they're trying to kind of retrofit LLMs back into Slack and finally deliver on that vision.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's a simple. I mean, this was the Slack announcement was a little bit of a yawn for me. It wasn't anything outrageous. Basically, it's summarization. You could certainly make the argument that Slack channels need summarization more than anything else, right? How long does it take me to read even a long email? But I can get lost in trying to follow a Slack channel and a Slack thread. So having summarization that is thread aware, I think is very valuable. And this kind of goes to what I'm talking about, right? This is an embedded piece, right? I could certainly use other AI tools and export the thread into it and ask it to summarize it, or have it apply as context. But in this case, it's just baked in. I hit a button and boom, I'm sort of caught up. And I also think it's a bit of a trend that we're going to see. Also, continue to evolve, and that is what I call it the yawn factor. We're already getting past the point of the big sensational announcements, and we're now sort of hitting that stage where this is about actually practical applications, and it's not necessarily new, but that doesn't mean it's not transformative. We're going to talk later about Zendesk, and that's the absolute category that what they announced falls into, and but that doesn't mean I don't think it's going to be super impactful. So this one is a bit of a yawn because it's a pretty narrow advancement of what Slack is doing with it, but I think it's very directionally indicative of where things are headed and what I think you can expect to see across every platform.
Yes, and there's a race to see who can get the knowledge base and the process and the UX right. And across that world, you have a whole bunch of different players, everybody from, I'll call it Slack to SharePoint to OpenText and its enterprise content management world, to the likes of ServiceNow, the automation anywheres. All of them have a piece of this puzzle that is actually quite necessary to make the big picture solution work. And Slack has to figure out how many of these pieces they can add on either via APIs or how many of the threads they have in Slack can work as part of the content management piece of the puzzle. You know, there's so much to build, but everybody else also has to build bits and pieces of this to make this work.
Well, and that actually speaks to I think one of the challenges that we're going to have. So if I we spend a lot of time talking here from the vendor perspective, but if I look at it from a CIO's perspective or an enterprise IT perspective, we've in the past talked about the need for an AI strategy and about how that's almost a wasted term because there is not one AI strategy. There's all these pieces, and I think this is a classic case of that, or maybe like the opening salvo of this. If I'm starting to put together an AI strategy from an enterprise perspective, I'm looking at it from a handful of standpoints, right? First, you mentioned knowledge. This ability to activate knowledge databases, knowledge networks within the organization becomes incredibly important as we're going through this, and how and where I activate it and to what channels we activate it becomes critical. So one of the places I'm starting is I'm looking at where all of my knowledge repositories, how am I ensuring that those are available, and then what are all the activation points? Where do I have a Slack bot? Where do I have whatever the different agents are sitting in different platforms, and what information do they have access to? And is it the right information contextually, right? Because the challenge with, and this is why to me it's slightly yawny, the challenge with what this Slack bot is going to do is it's going to summarize what's in that channel. But what I really need is the ability to contextualize that conversation with all of the institutional knowledge that exists within the organization that may be relevant to the conversation, and it's right now reliant on a actor in that thread to bring in that spreadsheet or bring in that link to a database or whatever it is to contextualize. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see these strategies evolve, and it's going to make the CIOs or the enterprise IT leaders' job complicated, because right now we're sort of relying on the vendors. We're sort of saying, okay, Slack, when are you going to bring that button? Okay, Microsoft, what is this Copilot going to do for me? And I think ultimately it's going to fall on the CIO or the enterprise IT group to actually orchestrate this, to weave it all together into a cohesive strategy that both simplifies the interface for my users, my consumers of that technology, and has a unified data model underneath it that actually allows me to activate with some confidence. And so I think this is going to become a complicated process as we get deeper into this.
Yeah, and as we know, CIOs are struggling to figure out how to use AI, how to use Copilots. You actually sent me over an interesting article about that, just how this discussion is going. How are CIOs trying to figure out the value of generative AI? I think this was actually in CIO.com, an article.
Yeah, it was a good article, mostly because it backed up everything I'm hearing on the street when I talk to CIOs. I'm hearing lots of grumblings. So I think there's this broad conversation that needs to be had, right? The term Copilot, kudos to Microsoft's marketing team. They nailed this term. Everybody is using it now. And that's the problem, right? There are Copilots everywhere. And a Copilot now simply means basically a on the side sort of chat thread that I can interact with some and ask it questions, or if it has context of what I'm doing, and that's fabulous. But there's massive differentiation in flavors, right? So part of the grumblings in this article about CIO was specifically around Microsoft's offering that people are going, is it worth $30 a user to have this productivity tool, right? Can we even measure what the productivity gain is? And can you in fact justify that? And so there's that whole conversation that's going on. But then you have this whole other sort of class of copilots. An organization I'm working with, this company called Symphony AI. It used to be called Symphony AI Summit, but they focus on enterprise IT, and they're about to be doing stuff in this area. But this is all purpose built, right? It's focused in specific domains, and I think you're seeing this again. We're going to talk about Zendesk in a little while. We're seeing these in these domains where people are using specific tools that now have a data set that is captive. That Copilot is not just raw productivity, it's like focused productivity or focused assistance. And so I think I think when we talk about any of this, but copilots in particular, it's dangerous to simply take it and think that term means the same thing everywhere. The context and how you're applying it is going to be all important. So yeah, I think it's an interesting time, and it's one of those fun terms that just got picked up everywhere.
Yeah, and part of the challenge for Microsoft is that when they put out an app like this, they want it to be like Word or Excel or PowerPoint, one of these apps that is call it generally accessible and usable for knowledge workers. But copilots don't actually work like that because they have some specific capabilities around content summarization or auto completion that are useful for I believe, as the article said, talking about filling the blank page with a starting point, a first draft, or some initial code that you can use to either structure a query or structure an application. That's where copilots really shine. But at the end of the day, you have to have some sort of additional work for the employee to do. If you believe that your 40-hour-a-week employee has 50 hours of work to do, and you can off-put some of that the lower level work so that they can get to that extra 10 hours of work. Copilot is an easy sell because that extra 10 hours of work at 20, 30, 50, 100, $200 an hour, whatever that number is, like that math makes sense because you automatically get to, $100, $200, $1,000 of value per month. So I'm going to pay that $30. I think the real issue is that for a lot of employees right now, there is not that management does not have the faith that they have that extra 2 or 5 or 10 hours a week of work to do that needs to be saved. So the business case doesn't make itself on a general perspective. And I see that more broadly as a management problem. Are people underemployed, or are people's work under visual? Is there a lack of visibility to the type of work that people are doing? Or is there a lack of strategy to how to take full advantage of people's skills? That's a much bigger challenge, but it's the challenge that Copilot actually faces. All of these generalized Copilots face as they are trying to make a more general sale. It's a future of
Yeah,
work
well,
problem.
and it goes to what we've been talking about, that it's going to become a sort of expected and almost mandated part of core apps.
Mhm.
And I wrote my first book, in fact, because of really two companies, Apple and Facebook at the time. And it was all about this idea of the consumerization of IT, that our knowledge workers would go home, they were using these products and they were amazing, intuitive, and they'd come back and we had green screens in the enterprise still, right? And
Yes.
you had this sort of rebellion of, it's like, I need better tech. This is horrible. Doesn't make any sense. And I think we're going to see a very similar thing. Now, there's an additional factor here, at least at the moment, with the high cost of processing these AI workloads. But we're going to have the same thing. I have trouble imagining how Microsoft is going to be able to continue to justify a $30 per month Copilot fee per user as all of these other tools continue to roll out AI assistants, Copilots, whatever they're called, as just an embedded part of their products over time. I also think as employees go home and are using the Facebook one or using these other tools, they're going to come to work and expect that there's going to be this pressure. Now, it's possible, I may be wrong, that the CIO gives first, but I really doubt it. In fact, I would be surprised if these conversations aren't already happening where CIOs are basically using this as a negotiating leverage to get Microsoft to throw it in. I have trouble imagining this continues to be this independent revenue model, because it's just going to become a standard way that we operate, at least in that general productivity side of it. So I think it's definitely going to be an interesting to see how that plays out, and how, where that sort of balance of power shifts. I will also say, I think, going back to the Microsoft wants us to be simple, it's confusing as heck right now. I was doing some research to try to get my handle on it, and they have at least 8 or 10 branded copilots right now, with more on the way, and it's super confusing. And again, I think this is going to be one of those things where people are trying to make hay with it, but it's going to just become part of the woodwork, an important part, but it's just going to be just part of how we function. I mean, I'm not sure if that's going to take a couple of years or what, but I think we're going to see that transition happen quickly.
Yeah, it feels like Microsoft is trying to bring its enterprise licensing terms to its consumer products, and I don't think that's a good evolution. But also, I struggle with the price as well. That I know I can get, call it Office for $10 a month. I can get G Suite for about $10 a month, and then telling me, oh, but you have to pay $30 a month to get to the AI stuff. And I understand that's because that's how much it costs Microsoft to provide the service, give or take. They probably have to pay literally $20 a month for all the juice and all the chips that it takes to make this work. But that doesn't justify the value for me. When I buy a new product, I remember seeing a long time ago a Harvard Business Review article about the 9X product. Basically, you have to think that you're getting 9 or 10x value on price for a new tech for it to be worth it. If you're going to charge me $30, I have to feel like I'm getting $300 a month. And I'm not sure that I buy that for a bunch of these capabilities at this point. So yeah, you can set the price wherever you want, but the uncertainty of what value I can get, it is a real question that the vendors are not solving in their marketing and messaging, and that's their job to
I think
justify the
it's a
price.
real issue. It's the whole value, and what business problem are we solving question is a real challenge right now in this entire era, because we're in such a Wild West era of just trying to be the first one to stake out claim. And I think, again, a non-enterprise story, but revelatory, is the absolute dismal launch of the Human AI pin, which, if you haven't following it, it's just a little pin that basically is supposed to replace a phone. And this was their classic mistake, I think, because that's their vision of the world. They're trying to replace the phone. They have no connections with either iPhones or Android, so it's a standalone device. But it also means that it has no apps. It is supposed to be voice only. It has this little visualization thing that projects onto your hand, which apparently just hasn't worked really well. And I think what the big lesson, I mean, forgetting the consumer side of it, right? The big lesson, if I'm an enterprise leader, is that do not get swept up in the hype of all of this, and make sure you're solving a real problem. I think, the big takeaway for Human AI, or Humane AI, the pin, is that they're solving a problem that nobody had, that nobody was really looking for this. We use our phones. We're happy with our phones. We're looking for, we want to have, something better than Siri, right? Apple needs to get on board, and we want to have that AI experience with our devices, but they were solving a problem with, a problem that didn't exist with an interface that nobody liked. It's like, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that that's probably not going to go well. And I think enterprises have the exact same risk of getting so swept up in, oh, we got to have the next Copilot, we got to do this, we got to do that, that they
Next
fail
AI,
to
AI, AI. Yeah.
what problem are you trying to solve? How is
Mhm.
this going to generate? How is this going to make your people more productive? How is this going to solve a business problem? And can I deliver it in a form factor that makes it easy to consume and use. And so, the same conversation about all these different AI agents and all these different products. Are you synthesizing that? Are you bringing that together? Am I creating a way that people can consume this that actually improves productivity and doesn't, in fact, make it harder and more time consuming? And that's going to be the big trick here.
Yeah, I wanted the Humane AI pin to be more useful just because I'm a Trekkie. And it reminds me a lot of, the Star Trek communicator and things like that. But the honest truth is that it's not ready for prime time. In practice, it reminds me a little bit of the Magic Leap AI, which also was supposed to project these things and make everything look amazing, but nobody could figure out what to use it for. And I think this has a similar problem. Just very, I will say, in some cases, very impressive tech, but it's not a product in the sense that nobody's asking for this and nobody knows how to use it. It's not like the iPhone where a million people literally picked it up and started touching it and figured out, wow, one touch to do everything that I ever wanted to access on a computer. This is perfect. That's not the experience here. So yeah, I think it's important to be able to tell the difference between impressive tech and actual products and services.
So let's staying on to the sort of consumer with the story of how does it affect the enterprise. There was on a much bigger stage big news at Google, and I was a little bit skeptical about the impact on the enterprise, but you seem to think that there's relevance. So why don't you kind of tee that one up for us?
Yeah, so one of the things that happened last week is Google had a pretty big reorg for the platforms and devices. So this affects things like Chromebooks, Android phones, basically anything running on Android. And they've changed the person in charge to basically a hardware guy, Rick Osterloh, who has been in charge of devices, services, hardware efforts. And to me, this brings the Android OS closer to the hardware. They are trying to integrate hardware and software, which is a pretty relevant story across the tech world so far. And this might end up meaning that Google or Alphabet will start taking a more broad-based approach to Android devices and be able to make more custom-made devices, bring the compute closer to the chip, or being able to embed some of the compute into the chip. And this might be worth a second look for companies that are trying to figure out how to create custom mobile devices, or how to integrate Android apps into their organization more deeply. Obviously, iOS, Apple, the iPhone is dominant in the enterprise. It's what knowledge workers like to use. But I can see a place for Android for call it rugged devices, or things where you don't want to pay $1,000 per device, but still want it to work. If you're creating these, call it $100 point of sale devices that just take your order, or these rugged field service devices that are custom made to collect specific types of data. That could be a good use for these for Android, especially integrating hardware and software together. So I see this could be an interesting move, and it might lead to having to reconsider Android usage for your mobile team and some of the other devices and endpoint management that are happening in the enterprise.
And there's no question that every enterprise has to deal with mobile devices, and so to that end, this is certainly at least potentially relevant. I'm a big believer in vertical integration. That's in fact why I am an Apple fan, because their walled garden vertical integration approach just means everything works. I've always felt that's been one of the gaps. I do think this is not enterprise specific, but I do think this is signaling that they've sort of reached this point of maturity. The separation historically was very much driven by the fact that they needed partners to produce the phones, and there's enough momentum there now where I feel like, or I think it seems to me that they feel like that's not something they need to be as openly concerned about. They're not necessarily going to go and cannibalize their partners by doing this, and so the vertical integration, I think, is probably a benefit, and probably will then apply or at least open the door for applications that are more enterprise specific because of it. All of that said, to me, I looked at this news and sort of like was a signal that things are, another additional signal and data point that says things are spinning at Google right now. That it's the corporate playbook. When things are a mess, what do? You reorg. And I'm not sure that bringing everything under, and from what everything I know about this gentleman, he's a good operator and a smart guy, and I, all that is great. But bringing more things under one level of control rarely creates greater speed and momentum. It generally creates an extra layer now. So I mean, the vertical integration maybe outweighs that. I don't know, but we'll see where it plays out. To me, if I'm an enterprise leader and I happen to be standardized in Android, I'm probably watching this, but that's probably about it for me.
Yeah, and I think that this kind of avoids the big question for Google, which, as we alluded to before, is whether Google can launch products. I'm not actually too worried about how quickly Google and Alphabet can create technologies and create ideas. I think their research is fast. They've obviously thrown out all sorts of things and put them into the market, sometimes prematurely. But will they be supported over time? And will the things that come out actually be enterprise grade? I think that has been a consistent problem. Call it across Google Cloud, Alphabet, anything that is an enterprise product that comes out of Alphabet is always kind of in question whether it is going to actually survive or whether it's going to be retired in 3 to 5 years, and then you have to go back to your prior provider anyways. So for me, that's the real question. Mobile is a big piece of the business for Alphabet, and hopefully this means they take it more seriously.
Yeah, I'm not overly concerned about that part. I think they have, a huge amount of mind share, huge partners. It's a huge piece of it. But I do think your point is extremely well taken, particularly in so many of the other parts of the Alphabet business. And I think what it really speaks to is that neither Alphabet nor Meta are really enterprise players. They're consumer companies, and because of that, they operate differently, I think. And so, I think you just have to sort of take it with a grain of salt. But yeah.
Yeah, but and speaking of, if you're trying to move from one client to another, there's an interesting announcement made by the Linux Foundation recently around kind of what they're calling the open platform for enterprise AI. They are bringing, a bunch of companies
Go ahead.
together
Sorry.
to just try to figure out how do we make AI standards that are applicable across different companies.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to spend a ton of time. It's worth knowing, I think, mostly because Linux Foundation does have a good track record in building these sort of consortiums. It is notable that most of the major players are not included. And so it's, I think we are still very early days, but that was the case in a lot of these sort of projects that they have. So I think this is a good sign. I think this need for interoperability is going to be critical. All these things that we've been talking about. So there's not a whole lot here. This is sort of an announcement, and it's like a statement of intent. And I think that's great. We'll have to see what they actually do and if it gets some legs.
Yeah, what I found interesting about it was the number of, let's call it them, venerable technology companies that are there, whether it's Intel, Red Hat, SAS, VMware, some definitely definite IT workhorses that have committed to being a part of this, which I think is good from a modernization perspective. But the question is whether there's enough new companies that are actually doing the cutting edge AI work needed to make this a real standard going forward.
Yeah. A lot of that was, a lot of the folks that have signed on, they have nothing but upside here. There's no downside. Whereas the people that feel they have first mover advantage, and they're a little bit more reticent. But again, I think we see that all the time. That's a common situation with emerging technologies. But I'm just excited to see any movement towards some form of standardization around interoperability, around portability. These are going to be major issues for organizations as we get out of the curiosity stage where we're just using it to summarize a meeting and actually starting to really embed this much more deeply into the organization. So I think it's a good thing. But I want to really talk. We have two sort of big announcements that I want to make sure we're talking about.
Yeah,
And I'm really curious on your take on both of them. Because I don't, were you at both events
I was only at one. Uh,
okay. Well, so the first one is Zendesk, and
mhm.
I'll let you tee it up. But here's what I found most notable in the Zendesk announcement was that I didn't hear it anywhere. There was almost no. It made almost no waves in terms of any of the stuff. I can't even tell you how many newsletters and things that I read with all the stuff. None of it talked about this, and that was sort of shocking because you sent it to me, and I'm glad you did. And I went through their press release, and it's like there's some good stuff here. So I don't know if you want to kind of tee it up, and then we can chat about. At least I'll share why I thought it was actually more noteworthy than it got credit for.
Yeah, so Zendesk, obviously one of the market leaders in service management, had their Relate conference last week, and as part of their announcement, they brought out their new AI capabilities, and they were pretty comprehensive. Zendesk has really put in some work to uh, put AI into their automation, create their co-pilot, as well as being able to access and summarize knowledge bases, where Zendesk has all sorts of knowledge bases. They are, again, a market leader in collecting this type of information, as well as being able to use AI for some of the more standard metrics and uh, kind of use cases that we've come to see in a bunch of other places. But the fact that Zendesk, as a service company, did a lot of the stuff that we alluded to earlier in the Slack announcement, Zendesk made it real, and they did it based on a foundational set of processes, capabilities, and data that they've already had in their platform. That made it feel more meaningful, at least to me.
Yeah, so we talked earlier about Facebook being the company that was going to break this wide open and for the consumer world as far as people
Mhm.
using AI. I think this is going to be something very similar with the segment of the enterprise. So I mentioned that I was shocked about the lack of news, and I think part of the reason was that when I read through that announcement, I actually read through it a few times, and the first time it was like, oh yeah, come on, this is all the same stuff, whatever. And this is the challenge with what we do. We've been around this stuff for a very, very long time.
Mhm.
And for the most part, none of what they announce. So first of all, let's give us some credit. As you said, very comprehensive. Unlike the Slack thing, which was like, okay, we're summarizing. This was a complete suite of AI enabled solutions or products, whatever you want to call them, capabilities baked into the product, right? So it was not one thing; it was an entire set of things, fairly ubiquitous and fairly horizontal across their platform. Um, and then if you look at the things, a autonomous agent, they have the workflow automation, agent copilot, workforce management, and the QA. My first read, it's like, well, we've done all of this. All of this has been done. There were conversational AI agents out before. There have been companies that have done the QA components where they're actually evaluating transcripts and scoring calls and doing coaching. But the reality is, it's all being done predominantly by these fringe players,
Mhm.
by small little players that nobody had ever heard of, that were really trying to get traction in the marketplace. So it's not so much that the technology is brand new, but it is a lot less involved, a lot less. No, that's not the right word. It doesn't require the handholding that some of these other technologies, older technologies, required. Right? They were really impressive on the demo. And then you realized how much work it took to make it do that, and you had trouble always penciling out if it was worth the effort. So because this is now LLM based, you overcome a lot of that. But secondly, it's just that it's Zendesk. It's that this is going to be exposed to thousands and thousands of enterprises that are now going to actually be able to see this pragmatically in practice and see results from it. And I think it's going to be one of those watershed moments that's going to start really changing the nature of how people look at it.
Yeah, one of the things that is fundamentally different about this AI world that we're in is that vendors and companies that have a lot of data have an unfair advantage right now. This is not the same as when cloud computing came out and it almost democratized the field for any mom and pop shop to suddenly compete with the rest of the world. AI is actually different in this case, in that the companies that have been investing in big data and their data environments over the past decade have a real advantage. So a company like Zendesk that can feed or train their models on all this data, or at least related transactions or related metadata, has a big advantage over every startup that wants to come up and try to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I do think that's going to be a huge differentiator, and I also think the combination of that and the ubiquity of application, just the fact that they have so much presence, and what I didn't, I know maybe you saw it, I didn't see, like, is this an added price or is this just being baked in? So that's going to be one of the big questions. But the more the friction is reduced, the faster I think we're going to see this, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that drives adoption.
Yeah, I feel like there's always an advantage to be enterprise pricing, that you can always fudge the details a little bit more.
Yeah, I do think, and I think it's going to lead into our last conversation, and that is that while Zendesk is a very focused play, they sort of sit in a very critical part of the enterprise ecosystem, and so because of that, I think it is something that's going to get a lot of attention. Right, they run the contact centers, the point of interaction post sale with almost, with countless organizations, of the relationship between the enterprise and their customers, and it's going to have this very highly elevated presence because of that. So I actually, I'm very bullish. I'm sad for them; they didn't get nearly the uptake from a press standpoint around it, but I think they're going to do well with this.
Yes, in retrospect, this was probably the actual most important enterprise AI announcement made last week. But it is hard to stand out when so many big companies are also yelling from the hills about how great their AI is.
Well, and it's blocking and tackling. This is the stuff that, ironically, it's not sexy. It's not, oh my God, that's amazing. And yet it's the stuff that actually drives real results that you're going to be able to pencil out an ROI on it.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the last one. The last one was the other big set of announcements, related, I guess, to AI, but not a core AI story, and probably slightly controversial. So, and that's all about what Workday is trying to do. So, if you want to tee that one up.
Yes. So last week I was at the Workday Innovation Summit, fantastic event they put out in the San Francisco area every year. And this year, one of the big focus areas that CEO Carl Eschenbach brought up was about wanting to establish Workday as an enterprise platform. Of course, Workday is known as an HR solution. They were also have broken $1 billion in revenues in financials at this point. So they kind of have this ERP-like positioning. But they say that they sell to kind of this trio of people. One is the chief HR officer, obviously. Second, with financials, the CFO. And then they say that they also sell into the CIO. And they're trying to set up themselves as being seen more as an SAP or Oracle, not in terms of being an old dinosaur, but in terms of being a programmatic uh, platform. But I don't think that Workday is seen that way right now, right? So I think there's this interesting challenge of trying to figure out what is an actual IT platform or an enterprise platform at this point, and who really qualifies for that. And so everybody wants to be a platform, but what's it mean to actually be a platform?
So I'll start with a couple caveats. The first is I do not cover HR systems at all, so I've
Me
never
neither.
had any yeah. So no deep involvement with Workday, and I don't blame them, because you're right. Everyone is trying to be a platform. I don't blame them from trying to go there, and I think they overall, directionally, it's the right move. I think that their sort of closed approach to things, their our
Mhm.
way or the highway sort of model of the past,
Yes.
has not served them well. We are in an era, and we have been actually in an era where it's all about being able to play nicely in the playground and connect with everybody and work with everybody. And they've been sort of that outlier around that. And so I think, all those are positive. They need to be. This is the right direction for them to be going. That said, I think they have an incredibly difficult road ahead of them. I mean, look, I don't think there's anything wrong with calling yourself a platform and saying you're open and using that to signal that we are playing nicely and that we are connecting and we are going to become more API centric. And if it's signaling, more power to them. If they're truly trying to compete in the platform wars and becoming one of the core enterprise platforms, I think I'm not going to, I never count anybody out, but that's a very difficult road for them to play. And here's the biggest reason. To me, that there's two core definitions of the platform. First and foremost, I have to be building something on top of you, right? I have to be building some layer that exists, whether that's I'm plugging in partners or I'm more likely building it directly. That has to be a core part of it. And secondly, it has to be this sort of part of the core operating business. And so that, we've talked a lot here about the fact that the fundamentals of transformation, the fundamentals of AI that sits on top of transformation is data and business process. And while clearly they are process oriented around the processes that they support, and clearly they have data around those, these aren't core business process, these aren't core data that are the things that a business actually operates on, right? That's the behind the wall kind of stuff. It's back office functionality. And you could try to make the case sort of around like what ServiceNow does as an example. And ServiceNow obviously has an HR component and a financial component. But my argument would be is that ServiceNow entire model and others of that ilk are about the underpinnings that actually cause an organization to run. And HR and finance just happen to be part of that, but it's this much broader take. And what I didn't see in that announcement is anything that actually helps me go there, right? Anything that helps me go to that broader place. And I'm not even sure that would be the right move for them. So, that's sort of my take. I think it's all the right signaling, all the right directional stuff, but I would not be considering them a major part of the kind of platform architecture of an enterprise.
Yeah, I find that Workday has done. I feel like they've done a good job maintaining a consistent data layer. So, like ServiceNow, they will refactor apps to fit into a standard platform. And as an internal platform, it works very well for maintaining updating capabilities. But it has not been an open platform to the same extent that ServiceNow is. When we look at ServiceNow, we can probably point at 100, maybe even more software solutions that are built on top of the ServiceNow platform that are not ServiceNow. Like I cover a company called Brightfin that does IT expense management. They are built on the ServiceNow platform, and they are literally a separate ISV. And Workday can't say the same thing about its data model and capabilities. And although Workday has this extend application development capability in place, it's not widely used. It's not ABAP or any of the. It's not an SAP or Oracle or Microsoft like programming construct that is well known to the developer world, and those are real technical challenges that exist. I know there are business partner challenges as well, but I'm not a super big expert on HR and finance partners and channels, so I'm not going to go deep into what that means from a business creation perspective. But I know that from a technical perspective, having the data layer is important, but you need developers at the end of the day. It was like Steve Ballmer yelling developers, developers, developers. And as over the top as he was correct about that assumption that without developers, you do not have a platform at the end of the day.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I think one of the things that, because I have, well, not closely, I have followed Workday, because they were one of the first, born in the cloud kind of players,
Yeah.
and that whole approach, and part of their whole pitch was that they were built for HR and exclusively for HR. It wasn't this sort of add-on thing, and that's what worked for them. But it's also now what is working against them if they are now trying to broaden that, because that's their entire foundation. And it's really, really hard. And you could, I guess you could say the same thing about Salesforce. They started, it was all about the sales, but I think Benioff always had much broader ambitions. He pivoted off that pretty quickly, expanded, lots of focus on the data layer, all those things that Workday
Yes.
never did. And so, I think you could look at it and say that Workday could follow that path, but that's a decade-long path, right? That's not
Yes.
something that's going to happen overnight. So,
And although it seems like the Salesforce Informatica rumors have fallen apart, despite that, uh,
soccer.
yes, despite that, there's no real doubt that Salesforce takes data seriously. They still have MuleSoft, they still have Tableau, they still do master data management, and they are a data layer that a lot of companies build apps on and around. And that's the challenge for a company like Workday to try to create a similar infrastructure after ignoring it and still scaling to the level that they're at. It's hard to rebuild the plane on the fly while you're trying to land it.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, I think it's directionally it's all the right things. So from that standpoint, I applaud them. I think probably if I'd been advising them, I probably would have said, hey, maybe you don't go with the platform language right out the gate. You build a little momentum over a year or two of putting some of this in place. But it's easy to Monday morning quarterback that.
Yes.
It's what they need to do, and I think they, as long as they are moderating their ambitions, and frankly make sure they don't alienate their core customer base as they do so, then I think it's all upside for them.
Yeah, but bringing it full circle, I think the platform approach is important because as we think about AI, we're thinking about everything from training data to models development to the data used to augment models, all the way to outputs to tuning, and then to ongoing management. And if you don't own every piece of that, it makes it really hard to really or have control of each part of it, either as uh, internally built or as an open source and transparent piece of the puzzle. It's hard to move forward, and I think a lot of companies are going to run into those dead ends and roadblocks head on in the next year or two.
Well, let's call a spade a spade. I mean, anybody who goes out there into the market and says we are the enterprise platform is blowing smoke and drinking too much of their marketing Kool-Aid, right? The only way you truly do this as an enterprise is to do it yourself. I remember talking to Phil Donahoe, am I saying his name right? The former CEO of ServiceNow, and this was at the time Salesforce was making a lot of news. SAP at the time was making more noise about the being an enterprise platform. And so I asked him this question, and he says, "Oh, there's plenty of room for all these platforms."
Mhm.
And I thought it was sort of a cop out answer, but I think it was actually dead on. It was, the reality is I'm, as a CIO, I'm going to pick two, maybe three of these major platforms that are going to be the foundation. And like today, Workday is not one of those. But I'm then going to have all the other parts that fit into my platform that I am building. That's the definition of a platform. That I have to have all the parts sit in there and fit and play nicely, to work together. And this is why where Workday is going is the right move, because if they want to have a place in that platform in the future, even if they never become the platform, if they want to be part of my platform, they need to be able to plug in. They need to be able to play nicely in the garden that I'm building here, and having all these parts interconnect. And that's really what's happening, is that I'm going to have, and if you're a large enterprise, you're going to have a whole bunch of these different. You're going to have ServiceNow, you're going to have
Mhm.
Salesforce, you're probably going to have SAP, you're going to have all these different platforms, and you're going to have them all connected. You're going to have a couple of tools that you weave everything together with,
Yes.
and everything has to sit on top. And then I'm going to build components on top of them that I'm going to then have to integrate and weave it together. And that then becomes what I call the transformational platform, right? This engine that actually powers the way my organization competes. And it's not any one. There's maybe if you're a really small company, but for any size, any company of any size, I'm going to have all these pieces that I have to assemble. And so, that's really what we're talking about. And that's where, in the end, this is all upside for Workday, as long as they don't become over ambitious with what they're trying to do.
Yes, the monolith is dead. Long live platform integration and and the rise of more subsidiary and secondary platforms.
Exactly. Exactly.
Wow. On that note, I think we're gonna call it a week. This was a lot to go over, and surprisingly, I think Zendesk won the episode today. That's which is not what
Which
I would have expected going into all these announcements by Meta and Alphabet and Salesforce and Microsoft and everybody else. But so
we should start doing that. Should be winners and losers of the week. Who won the week and who lost the week? That'd be fun.
yes. Well, I'll give the award to Zendesk for this week. Good job, y'all.
All right.
And with that, let's do the same thing next week.
Till then.